Welcome to this episode of Kennedy Saves the World. So obviously, healthcare, medicine, insurance in this country has left us just at odds with each other, with the healthcare system, sometimes with physicians. And it's frustrating. It's scary to think that maybe someday you are going to fall ill with cancer or some other godforsaken medical ailment, and you either won't be able to understand or you won't be able to afford the treatment that you need, because it really feels like our healthcare system in this country is upside down. And, you know, a lot of people say there's not enough government involvement. We need a single payer system. We need the government to handle everything. And then there were those of us who are rationalists who say that maybe the government needs to get out of healthcare because maybe government entrenchment in our entire medical system is what has complicated it and made it so difficult for so many people to access the care that they need and deserve. One of the, I would say, free market advocates for a more private, personalized, individualized healthcare system is Surgeon Dr. Jeffery Singer. And he has a new book out through the CATO Institute where he serves as a senior fellow called Your Body, Your Healthcare. He is a phenomenal writer. I've been reading your stuff for years, and I was very excited that you have a new book out. So, it's a nice way to dive into all the ways that government has intrusively kind of screwed up healthcare and what really needs to be done to fix it. Dr. Singer, welcome to the podcast.
Great to see you again, Kennedy.
Great to see you too. So you start the book talking about informed consent. So let's discuss that. And I want you to define that and what that means for people who maybe they've heard the phrase, but they don't know what it means for them in terms of the medical care they might receive.
Right. The book is basically all about autonomy, and it's dedicated to autonomous adults everywhere. And nowadays, we doctors who go through medical school, we have it drilled into us from the beginning that you must respect your patient's autonomy. You can't do anything to them or perform a procedure or a test or whatever without their informed consent, without you explaining clearly to them, you know, what it is you want to do, the pros, the cons, the alternatives, and make sure they understand and then they're okay with it. And if they're not okay with it, even if you think they're making a horrible mistake, you just got to respect that because it's their body, their healthcare. So that's the way we are now, but it wasn't always that way. It's only been that way about the last 50 years. It was recently.
And I didn't realize how long that sort of paternalistic, controlling, we decide for you mentality had been so pervasive in medicine.
Yeah, in fact, there was a very famous case that kind of started turning things around back in the early 20th century. It was called Schlowendorf versus the Society of New York Hospital. There was a woman named Mary. In those days, we didn't have CT scans and things, so it was very common to do what was called an examination under anesthesia, where, you know, all the muscles are relaxed and you can get a pretty accurate exam.
Was that the lady who had a uterine tumor?
Yeah. So,
and she was like, hey, I don't want surgery. You know, so if you're in there, don't start taking things out.
Just, you can take a look and then wake me up and we'll discuss what it is and I'll decide what I want to do. Well, the doctor felt the tumor of the uterus turned out to be a fibroid tumor, did a hysterectomy. She had all sorts of complications. She survived, but she was pissed, understandably. Yeah. She sued and she won, and then it went to appeal. And in the appeals court, Judge Benjamin Cardoza of the New York State Court of Appeals, who later became a justice on the Supreme Court, he basically started the ball rolling by saying, I'm paraphrasing now, I have the exact quote in the book, but basically every person owns their own body, and to do something to them without their informed consent constitutes an assault. And what was done to her was an assault. So that, and then there were several other cases, but even through the mid-20th century, we had, you know, experiments, the infamous Tuskegee experiment, where we were seeing how syphilis, if you don't treat it, what happens without telling the patients there was a treatment for it. We had the Nuremberg war crimes trials with the live human experiments, et cetera, et cetera. So it's only in as late as around 1970 that the medical profession may change their ethics. And what I point out is, well, that's good, but when it comes to the government respecting patients' autonomy, they don't do that at all. So the government, on different levels, on a state level, the government tells you what kind of healthcare practitioner you, an adult, are allowed to get advice from. or get treatment from
Yeah.
through, licensing laws and scope of practice laws. In about half the
Yeah,
states,
and you go into great detail about that, and you use an example like if I want to practice psychiatry, like I'm a medical doctor, I can do that. However, if I want to work in a hospital, the hospital will not allow me to do that because I didn't have a residency in psychiatry. I'm not board certified as a psychiatrist, and
I'm really glad you brought up an example because I was going to forget to mention that. But most people think that the license protects the public, but actually it protects the doctors. And it was the medical association that was created in the 1800s with the express mission of getting doctors licensed, because nobody in those 1800s nobody was licensed for anything, and it was to keep out competition. So I explained that I'm a surgeon for 40 years, and if I just decide, I'm ready for a change, I'm kind of bored, I want a new challenge, and I've been reading a lot of psychiatry texts, so I think I'm going to change the sign on my door to say psychiatrist. I can totally do that because I'm licensed to practice medicine, and psychiatry is part of medicine. But what protects the public is when I try to get privileges at the private hospital, the credentials committee is going to ask me where I trained in psychiatry. And when I told them, well, I've been reading a lot and, going to weekend courses, they say, well, come back after you do a residency. And same thing with the health plans. If I want to be on their panel as a mental health professional, they're going to ask me, oh, you did a residency? And then more importantly, if I want to get malpractice insurance coverage, the insurance company's going to say, well, we're not covering you for that. We'll be happy to keep covering you for anything goes wrong with your surgery, but not for this.
Wow.
So what's protecting the public? All these private actors that are looking out for their own self-interest. They're concerned about their liability and their reputation. So on that level, not only people think we need licensing, but the licensing is to restrict competition. And I get into that in the book, how there were a whole lot of, in modern times, a lot of what at one point were maybe just ancillary health professions like nursing or I can't think offhand at the moment, but a whole bunch of ancillary health professions. They've gotten much more sophisticated, and they've gotten extra training, can do a lot of things now that could provide services that doctors are actually overtrained for. So, for example, we have nurse practitioners who could provide, research shows they provide excellent primary care, but in half the states, the state licensing laws won't allow them to practice independently of a doctor. They have to work for a doctor or have a contract with a doctor.
Yeah, and like a physician's assistant, a PA,
Same thing.
Might have, incredible expertise, way better bedside manner, and more time interfacing with patients.
They usually do.
Yeah.
And pharmacists, okay? So in 3 states now, Idaho, Montana, and Colorado, but in Ontario, Canada, and Alberta, Canada, for years there, if you have a common everyday thing like a UTI or you think you have a strep throat, we all know there's a little swab test you can get for that.
Sure.
Well, in those states, those 3 states, you could stop by at a pharmacy on the way home from work or whatever, and they could perform that little test and prescribe an antibiotic for you for your strep throat or your UTI. I mean, they know, most pharmacists these days are a doctor of pharmacy, PharmDs. They know more about drug interactions than a lot of doctors get training for in medical school.
And there's a big difference between a pharmacist and a pharmacy tech. But a pharmacist knows all of the drugs
6 years of
and
school.
also knows how all the drugs interact with each other. Doctors don't necessarily know that, but if you go to Europe, and you bring this up in the book, and I've always been curious why it's not like this, because, for example, I had a really bad sinus infection, and I needed Mucinex D or something with an actual decongestant because I was flying, and I was in Portland, Oregon. So in California and New York, you have to show your ID in order to get a real decongestant that's behind the counter. In Oregon, at least at the time, you had to have a prescription from a doctor.
Right. It was Oregon and Mississippi. They did away with that.
So, at the time, like, I couldn't go into a pharmacy, but if I had been able to talk to a pharmacist and said, I'm on this antibiotic, I'm flying, I don't want my sinus infection to get worse. I don't want to damage my eustachian tubes while I travel. Yeah. Can you give me a behind-the-counter
well, think of all the common everyday things people have that they know what's going to happen when they get to the doctor's office. After they have to take an afternoon off from work, wait in the waiting room for an hour, then another hour in the exam room, and they know the doctor's going to do the swab test and give them a prescription for ampicillin or something like
Yeah.
that. They know it.
Before the result comes back.
Right. Why can't you just do that at the pharmacy on the way home from work and work it into your, and not even have to leave work as
With
early?
like 80% of the stuff that people
Right.
get prescriptions for. Like in Europe, you can. You go in and you talk to a pharmacist and they're like, what are your symptoms? What do you need? And then they give you something. And but here.
But in most states, the government says, nope, you got to go to a doctor for that. Why is that? Because the government's in charge of deciding who gets to practice what.
Yeah.
And I kind of turn it around from the standpoint of the presumption of liberty, the presumption of autonomy. So instead of the government deciding who gets to practice what kind of profession, in reality, it's the government is in the way of me deciding who I want to get advice from.
Yes.
When you think about it, that's really what's happening. So if in Colorado and Idaho they said, okay, we're going to let pharmacists prescribe medicines for UTIs, and
Have
they
people
basically are
been
saying we're going to
ODing
stop.
left and right? Like, have mortality rates gone up in those states?
In fact,
because
we doctors often call a pharmacist and say, I got a problem here. I got a patient who's on this and this medication, and I want to prescribe something for the problem, but I'm worried about it. What I prescribe might interact with the meds the patient's on.
Mm-hmm.
And a pharmacist will tell me over the phone, oh, you know what, that it does interact. Let me suggest something else.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're trained to do. So, but it's not that the government is allowed the pharmacist. The government, the way I kind of frame it is, the government has gotten out of the way of we adults deciding, oh, we want to go to the pharmacist. That I know that a doctor knows a lot about, but I want to ask the pharmacist. Why can't I?
I don't know why you can't. I mean, but you bring up that maybe we shouldn't have licensing at all.
Right.
But that scares people. So
I know
people
it
hear
does.
that and they go, well, then every doctor is going to be Conrad Murray.
Well, like I explained, Conrad Murray is licensed, by the way.
I know.
But like I explained in the book, I could declare myself a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And who knows what kind of quality work I'll do, but I got a license, so I could do that. Meanwhile, there are 7 states that allow this, but there are clinical psychologists, these are PhDs or PsyDs, who've done extra training. They got master's degree level training in psychopharmacology, and they've taken a standardized test and done like a 1-year internship. And in those states, they could prescribe psych meds, so that if they do talk therapy. Psychiatrists, most don't do talk therapy anymore. They just talk to you for a few minutes and prescribe a medicine for you. So if you're seeing a psychologist and having talk therapy, and a psychologist determines, you're so agitated, we need to get you on something just so we can make some progress here. And it's like this particular psychologist done all his training, so they know exactly what you need.
That sounds like
they can't do it.
A better option for most people.
And ironically, that psychologist can call me up, a surgeon,
Yeah.
and say, could you do me a favor? Would you prescribe Lexapro to my patient? Because I'm not allowed. And I'm a surgeon, so I don't usually prescribe Lexapro.
Yeah.
But I said, how do you spell that? How much of a dose is that? And they'll tell me what to write. And I could do that because I have a license.
Yeah.
See? So that's the whole point.
Don't go anywhere. More Kennedy Saves the World right after this.
So how can we fix, from your perspective of the individual leading their healthcare decisions and what they put in their body? What are like 3 things that the government can do to get out of the way to fix the system? Because it feels like the system is really broken. Yeah. When you have someone like Luigi Mangione murdering United Health Group CEO because he doesn't like the insurance industry, and people are cheering that and, funding his online campaigns,
I know.
Something is wrong with our system.
Well, it has to do with the government is even telling you what kind of health insurance you can get, and how much can be used for what, and what coverage you must have, which raises the cost of health insurance. I mean, there's so many different levels, but the first thing we need to do is we need to have, both on the federal and state and local level, we have have to have the government get out of gradually. You can't do it all at once, obviously, but gradually start a program of getting out of regulating all these things. I argue in my book that since my profession gets it finally, after many, many years, for the last 50 years, we get it. We marinate in this ethics now. Then we should be the ones, since we're the ones interacting with patients, we should be the ones that are actually leading the charge in this. We should be the tip of the spear, arguing for patient autonomy and having a healthcare system that respects us as adults making our own decisions.
Yeah.
And that's the point I make in my book.
Yeah, and it's a very important point, and I don't think people realize the amount of control that the FDA has over our lives. And people are like, well, you can't just let anything on the market.
Yep.
But what is the solution to that? If you
We
get
don't
rid
need
of the
to have
FDA,
an FDA.
okay, so what do you do? How do you keep bad things from getting
Okay.
into
Well, first of all,
people's-
before 1938, we didn't have the FDA didn't have to approve drugs, but there were other means of vetting drugs. For example, the American Medical Association, even though I'm angry with them for their special interest pleading years ago, they did good things too, and they created a council on pharmacy and chemistry. And their policy was, if you're a pharmaceutical company, you want us to officially call you an ethical company, then you have to let us review all the tests on the drug that you came out with and vet it. And if not, we're not going to call you ethical, and we're not going to let you advertise in any of the medical journals that our doctors see. So major companies like Merck and Pfizer, they said, we want to be ethical and we're going to play ball. So that was one way. There are many others that were also testing drugs. In 1938, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed, and from that point forward, no drug could be brought to market without the FDA being convinced it's safe. Anything was already on the market, like aspirin, which could be dangerous, there were the regular. Many people don't know this, but the regular and NPH insulin, they came around during World War One, so they were already, you can get that over the counter to this day. Most people don't know that.
Wow.
You can get it at Walmart. I think Walmart's brand is called, I think, Relion, Relion. Not advertising here, but you can. In fact, if you went up to the counter at a Walmart or any other pharmacy and say, I'd like to buy some regular insulin, the tech probably will say, well, you got to have a prescription. And then just say, can I talk to the pharmacist, please? Because the pharmacist knows they could sell it to you without a prescription. So it's much cheaper. It's not nearly as convenient as the modern form, but, it works. So anything prior to 1938 was grandfathered. Anything going forward, you had to convince them that it was safe.
But they just got more and more powerful and
In
bigger.
1951,
And, it's like you have drugs like Naloxone you talk about.
Naloxone,
Sorry. And it's been on the market in, I think, Italy for decades.
You can get it over the counter in Italy, in Australia. Well, in 1951, Congress passed an amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that said from this point forward, the FDA decides what's prescription only and what's over the counter. So up until then, the pharmaceutical companies made that decision. They come up with a medicine and if they think this is too complicated, something can go wrong and we're going to get sued. So they would tell the pharmacy, don't sell this to anybody unless they have it's a contract. You can't sell this unless they have a prescription from a physician, let's say. And that kind of covered them, okay? But that was their decision. But starting in 1951 was the FDA's decision. So we have a situation now like birth control pills.
Yes.
In 100 countries, you can get them over the counter. The American College of OBGYNs for 20 years has been saying, you don't need to come to see us to get an exam and a prescription. You should be able to get this over the counter.
Yeah.
And by the way, they get paid when you come to see them. So if they're telling you don't need to come see me, that means something.
Yeah, that means they trust women to make their own choices about their contraception.
Right, because they got an incentive incentive to say, no, you should come see me, right? It's not safe.
Yeah, but I didn't realize. So you were talking about the mini pill. Yeah. You can now get over the counter,
One
which is
brand.
Progesterone only.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is not very convenient.
If you have to take it at the exact same time every day, and it's
you got like 3-hour window.
Yeah, and if you miss it, you got to use some other contraception for the entire month.
Right, and they only allow one brand because one company out of Europe applied. It's called Opil.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the two hormone birth control pills, which you can get, like I say, in 100 countries. If you live close to the border, like I do in Arizona or people in Southern California, you can go in Arizona, you go to Nogales or go Tijuana, and you just buy it there. But
yeah, you can buy anything there.
That's true.
I haven't been to Tijuana in a while, but whoo!
And naloxone, the same thing.
Yeah.
Finally, they made the spray over the counter. Now, there's a lot of reasons why they don't do this. Number one, they have a tendency to be they're captured by the pharmaceutical companies. If you look at the regulations, they could make it over the counter if a pharmaceutical company requests a review for that, or quote any interested party, or the commissioner could just decide, I'm making this over the counter. But so when it came to naloxone, the FDA commissioner back in 2016 said in a blog post, we think this is ready to be over the counter. We invite the pharmaceutical companies to ask us, and they never did. Then about 2 years later, Scott Gottlieb was the FDA commissioner, and he wrote a blog post saying, we don't usually do this. We usually require you to come up with a labeling that satisfies us if you want to make it over the counter. But we took we went to the effort of coming up with a label, so it's already ready to go.
Ready
All
to
you
go.
have to do
Just
is sign
slap it
right
on
here.
there, yeah.
They didn't want to do it. Why?
Why?
Because we have a third-party payer system, which is a big part of the problem. And just anybody who's gotten a bill from a hospital or doctor knows what I'm talking about. So the pharmaceutical company could overcharge the insurance company, and get paid more than they would have if they're dealing directly to the consumer. And so that's why. That's why they didn't ask. And finally, the FDA said, we got, when naloxone became spray became generic, they said, we got this application from a European generic naloxone maker to make it over the counter. And this is what lit a fire under them. They said, we're thinking that we're going to probably approve this for over the counter.
Yeah.
And if so, then as far as we're concerned, anybody else who makes naloxone, just ask us. We think it's ready for over the counter. And all of a sudden, the makers of naloxone nasal spray say, okay, we're going to want to make it over the counter.
We don't want to miss out on that market share.
So that's what it took. Wow. But they didn't have to do that. They could have right away just done it.
How do you think the RFK Jr. era is going to go now that he's Health and Human Services Secretary?
I'm a little nervous. Okay. First of all, I like when he says, I remember this when he was a Democratic candidate for president. He said, look, medicine is not a priesthood. Mm-hmm. You should do your own research and make your own decisions. And that's one of the points I make in my book. So I'm totally down with that.
Yeah, that's part of autonomy.
Yeah, right.
It's like you also, yes, you have the ability to make decisions, but it is incumbent upon you to make the best decisions for yourself.
Exactly. So I was down with that. Then in that same town hall that he had, he said, but I don't think the government should allow direct-to-consumer advertising by pharmaceutical companies. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. So only the priesthood gets to know what these medicines are and what's in them? You can't. I thought for me, doing my own research. How am I going to do my research if they can't advertise? So I see these kind of inconsistencies. I also have a problem. I don't think the government should be in the business of telling you what you should eat and what's good for you, what's not good for you.
I agree with you
there. You should talk about that with your healthcare practitioner.
And it's like, I agree that there's a lot of crap in our food and people make bad choices, and I know there are food deserts.
But it's not the government's business.
Exactly right. Don't think that you can rely on the government to tell. I mean, it's like, we had a fit when Michelle Obama was taking delicious things the kids eat out of their school lunches, like chocolate milk.
Exactly.
And that was some of the only ways kids were getting protein and calcium.
Right.
And she's like, well, it's delicious.
Plus the science and nutrition, as you know, it's very bad because it's hard to do good nutritional research because you can't experiment on people. That's unethical. You can't say, let me feed this guy this thing and this guy this and see who dies. Yeah. You can't do that. So you have to do most of retrospective stuff, and you ask people to keep journals, and it's not that accurate. So what everybody thought back, in the 80s was the way to go. It turns out, no, actually what your parents were doing before then was the way to go. Yeah. So I'm concerned that Kennedy wants to get rid of all the recommendations that the government's making now and replace it with his own set of preferred recommendations. And I'd rather he just get rid of those recommendations and say, you guys talk to your doctor or your nurse practitioner or whomever and ask them what they think.
There's plenty of information out there. Like, we've never had more information about health and nutrition than we do right now. It is not difficult to ascertain. And, it is incumbent upon us as individuals and as parents to figure that out and give our children, our families, the very best that we can offer them. We don't need to rely on the government to get permission to feed our children certain things. Does it mean that, I jam red dye 40 down my girls' throats? Typically, I do not.
Yeah, even that. So states are now banned. There's, again, autonomy. States are saying, let's say I'm okay with food that has red dye number 3 in it, which is people have been eating for, how many years. And I'm okay with it, and I really like the color of my Fruit Loops. And I don't want those pastel Fruit Loops. I want the bright red Fruit Loops. So the government says now I can't have that. But it's not like I don't have a choice. You go to any supermarket these days, they have aisles of food like organic food, which, by the way, is certified by private, not government, certified agencies. And, you can have food advertised all the time, no additives, no artificial food.
Absolutely.
So it's not like nobody's
Whole Foods is owned
an option.
by Amazon now. This is a massive multi-billion-dollar industry. You've never had more choices. Walmart, at least according to Matt Welch, sells more organic produce than any other seller in the world.
I totally believe that. But the point is, it's not like I can't get it. So why don't you just now this is a lot of state level stuff. Why don't you politicians just mind your own business? I'm doing my reading, and if I decide I don't want to have something that has red dye number 3 in it, then I'll pick the box that says no red dye number 3.
Exactly.
Don't make it where I can't have it.
Yeah.
That's all.
I agree with you completely. Individuals are always better left to make their own bad choices than having the government make choices for them. And that's what this book is all about. Your body, your health care. Dr. Jeffery Singer. Get it right now. He lives in Arizona. You can go see him, and he'll eat your heart out. Legally. He's a legal cannibal.
I could do that.
You can do anything. Phenomenal thinker, great writer, and a brilliant doctor. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Jeff Singer. This has been Kennedy Saves the World. I'm Kennedy.
Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app. Oh, go ahead and leave me a review while you're there. I'd love to hear what you have to say. You've been listening to Kennedy Saves the World on the Fox News Podcast Network.